I want to start this story somewhere quiet, because that's how it began. Not with screaming in the streets, not with fire climbing the skyline, not with panic or chaos, but with confidence, deep, unshaken confidence built over centuries. I want to take you back to February of 1258, because that's when the most powerful family in the Islamic world made a choice they believed was safe. It didn't feel reckless, it didn't feel desperate, it felt familiar, rooted in tradition, faith, and the memory of surviving every crisis that had come before. And that belief, more than any weapon, would wipe them out of history completely. Inside the Abbasid Palace in Baghdad, the Caliph and his family waited. Time moved slowly there. Gold-lined walls reflected soft lamplight, the kind that makes everything feel warm and permanent. Fountains fed by the steady flow of the Tigris River murmured quietly through courtyards, just as they had for generations. The sound was familiar, comforting. Around them stood libraries filled with knowledge gathered from across the known world. Books so old they predated most nations on Earth. This was a world designed to feel eternal, a world of ceremony, routine, and inherited authority. From inside those walls, it was easy to believe that whatever danger existed beyond the gates was distant, exaggerated, or temporary. The palace didn't just shelter bodies, it sheltered beliefs. And the strongest belief of all was that Baghdad was too important to fall. Outside those walls, that illusion was already collapsing. The Mongols were in position. Siege engines stood ready, assembled with calm, practiced efficiency. Horses moved across the plains in numbers so vast that the ground itself seemed to vibrate beneath their hooves. The sound never truly stopped. And in the distance, thin columns of smoke drifted upward from villages that had already been erased, places where people had lived ordinary lives only days earlier. For more than 500 years, Baghdad had been many things at once. It had ruled empires, it had shaped laws, it had educated the world. Scholars crossed deserts and seas just to reach it, to sit in its libraries, to translate, debate, and preserve knowledge that might otherwise have vanished forever. Ideas were drawn to Baghdad the way gravity pulls matter inward. And because of that long legacy, the people who governed it believed something dangerous. That Baghdad was untouchable. That a city this sacred, this important, could not truly be destroyed. That belief didn't come from arrogance alone. It came from experience. Baghdad had outlasted rivals. It had endured invasions, civil wars, internal decay. Other capitals had fallen while Baghdad remained. Over time, survival hardened into certainty. But what came next was not another crisis it could absorb. What followed wasn't a sudden explosion of rage. It wasn't chaos spiraling out of control. What happened was calculated, organized, and carried out with chilling precision. This was not destruction driven by emotion. It was a planned dismantling of an entire ruling bloodline, executed step by step, with a clear ideological purpose. By the time I'm done telling this story, there are a few uncomfortable truths I think you'll see more clearly than most history books are willing to admit. You'll understand why the Mongols didn't simply execute the Abbasid Caliph outright, and why the way they killed him mattered more than death itself. You'll see why every member of Baghdad's royal household was treated as a political problem to eliminate, not a captive to be spared. And you'll see how the destruction of one family reshaped global history in ways that never fully healed. This isn't a story about blind savagery. It's a story about power, procedure, and erasure. Interested in medieval history? Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's astonishing how far these stories travel. And this story doesn't begin with the walls coming down. It begins long before that. The man at the center of it all was Al-Mustaʿsim, the 37th Abbasid Caliph. On paper, his bloodline connected him to one of the greatest empires the world had ever known, an empire that once stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of China. That history carried enormous symbolic weight. It shaped how others saw him. It shaped how he saw himself. But by the time Al-Mustaʿsim ruled, that empire existed mostly in memory. In reality, his authority barely extended beyond Baghdad and its surrounding lands. Real power had already drained away into the hands of viziers, military commanders, and rival dynasties who ruled independently while still invoking the caliph's name. He sat on the throne, but the machinery of power no longer answered to him. What he still possessed wasn't force. It was symbolism. And symbolism was what he trusted most. So when Mongol envoys arrived demanding submission, tribute, and recognition of Mongol supremacy, the caliph didn't react like a ruler preparing for war. He didn't raise new armies. He didn't strengthen defenses that had gone untouched for generations. He didn't summon troops from the provinces or prepare the city for siege. Instead, he wrote letters. Letters invoking God's protection. Letters reminding the Mongols of his sacred role as caliph. Letters insisting that Baghdad was a holy city and therefore untouchable. To Al-Mustaʿsim, words had always carried weight. They always had. But to the Mongols, those letters meant something very different. The Mongols did not recognize sacred cities. To them, there were only two options: submission or destruction. When Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and commander of the Mongol armies in the west, read those letters, he didn't see diplomacy. He saw refusal. And refusal triggered a system the Mongols had already perfected across Asia, one sanctioned at the highest levels of their empire. Hulagu was not acting on impulse or personal ambition. His mission had been authorized by the Mongol court itself. Baghdad's fate was not an accident. It was policy. The Mongols did not govern by learning to live alongside old rulers. They governed by ending them. Completely. Their thinking was simple and ruthless. As long as a royal bloodline survives, rebellion remains possible. Memory remains. Legitimacy remains. So when they conquered a state, they didn't stop at defeating its army. They dismantled its ruling class piece by piece. Kings were killed, heirs were erased, women were absorbed or redistributed, symbols were smashed, records were destroyed. This wasn't mindless brutality. It was insurance. Baghdad, however, presented a unique problem. The Abbasid Caliph wasn't just another king. He was a religious authority whose legitimacy extended far beyond the land he actually controlled. As long as he lived, resistance could rise anywhere under his name, even in regions the Mongols never intended to occupy. Hulagu Khan did not march on Baghdad to rule it. He marched to end the Abbasid institution entirely. The siege began in January of 1258 and ended in February. That speed alone tells you how unbalanced the situation truly was. Mongol engineers redirected the Tigris River, flooding defensive positions the city relied on. Siege engines hammered walls that hadn't been modernized in generations. The Abbasid forces, poorly funded, disorganized, and unprepared, collapsed almost immediately. Inside the city, fear spread fast. Whispers turned to panic. Prayers filled the air. Outside the walls, Mongol discipline never cracked. When Baghdad finally surrendered, the caliph was not immediately killed. Instead, he was forced to witness the end of his authority. He was brought before Hulagu Khan and compelled to formally surrender the city himself. Treasures were handed over. Seals of office were removed. Symbols of Abbasid rule, accumulated over centuries, were taken piece by piece. Only after the institution had been stripped away was the man isolated. When Mongol troops entered the Abbasid Palace, they did not behave like looters tearing through a prize. They behaved like auditors. The royal household was separated from servants. Names were written down, family ties traced, marriages identified, children counted. Much of this work was done with the help of Abbasid officials themselves, men who had once served the state, now compelled to identify its elites. From this moment on, nothing happened by accident. The Mongols believed that spilling the blood of kings or sacred figures could offend the heavens, so they developed alternatives. Al-Mustaʿsim was not dragged before a crowd. There was no spectacle, no public execution. Instead, he was tightly wrapped in heavy carpets and layers of felt until his body could not move. Then they brought in horses. Slowly, again and again, the animals were led over him. Bones crushed, organs failed, and when he died, not a single drop of royal blood touched the ground. The taboo was observed. The message was absolute. Your God did not intervene. Your title did not protect you. Your bloodline ends here. This was not mercy. It was symbolic annihilation. After the caliph's death, attention turned to his sons. They weren't generals. They weren't decision-makers. But they were heirs. And heirs are dangerous. Some accounts describe immediate execution. Others mention brief detention. But every source agrees on the outcome. The Abbasid princes did not survive. Not one male heir was allowed to live. This wasn't revenge. It was policy. The women of the Abbasid court were not spared. Some, especially those closely tied to succession, were executed. Others were taken captive and redistributed among Mongol elites and allies. Royal women were not seen as innocents. They were seen as carriers of legitimacy. Marriage could pass authority. Children could resurrect dynasties. So the household was shattered, scattered, absorbed. There was no Abbasid family living on in exile. The line ended there. Then the rest of Baghdad was unleashed. What followed wasn't chaos. It was organized ruin. Libraries were not simply burned. Manuscripts were handled, examined, and selectively removed before destruction. Knowledge wasn't destroyed blindly. It was dismantled. Scholars were killed, hospitals destroyed, canals deliberately broken, infrastructure crippled by design. Witnesses said the Tigris ran black with ink and red with blood. The goal wasn't terror alone. It was irreversibility. Baghdad was not meant to recover. When news of the caliph's death spread, it sent shockwaves across the Islamic world. Rulers hesitated. Cities froze. For the first time in centuries, there was no caliph in Baghdad, and no one knew what that absence meant. The Mongols did not destroy Baghdad because they hated Islam. They destroyed it because it represented continuity. By eliminating the Abbasid family, they severed the symbolic head of an entire civilization. There would never again be a caliph ruling from Baghdad. No uncontested center, no unified authority. Islam endured, but it fragmented. Power shifted to Cairo, then later to Istanbul. Baghdad never reclaimed its role. The Mongols didn't just kill people. They redirected history, and the fall of Baghdad was not inevitable. It happened because of complacency, miscalculation, and faith in symbolism over force. The Mongols were not invincible, but they were ruthless about systems. So, I'll leave you with this. If you had lived inside Baghdad's palace in 1258, surrounded by gold, scholarship, and centuries of tradition, would you have believed the city was untouchable? Or would you have seen what the Mongols saw? That once symbols lose their power, bloodlines become expendable. If this story stayed with you, let me know in the comments. And if you want more history like this, Stories people don't like to talk about. Like, share, and subscribe.